My name is Susanna Mack, and I'm a cardiologist from the Sinai Health System. And this is your self-learning module on cardiovascular physiology, focus on the heart, part 2. Again, I have nothing to disclose. The learning objective for this lecture is to describe the physiologic determinants of cardiac output and stroke volume, and define preload, afterload, and contractility. And this module should build on the previous module, which described the basics of cardiac function using something called the pressure-volume loop. By the end of this module, we hope that you should be able to describe the loading conditions and their influence on cardiac output. So these are determinants of systolic function. And the first condition I'm going to talk about is something known as preload. Preload, strictly speaking, refers to the length or stretch of a single myocyte when it's relaxed. In left ventricular chamber mechanics, preload refers to the left ventricular end diastolic volume, so the volume of the ventricle when it's filled. Increases in preload increase contractility and therefore increase stroke volume. And that's an intrinsic property of the ventricular myocardium, and that's known as the force length or the Frank-Starling relationship. So as we reviewed in the previous module, in the healthy heart, the end diastolic or maximal chamber volume is this point, the lower right-hand corner of the loop, and preload refers to this point, which is also measured as the left ventricular end diastolic volume. So the left ventricular end diastolic volume depends on the amount of blood that comes back to the heart, so it depends on venous return. It also, though, depends on the amount of blood left behind from the previous systole. And finally, it depends on the ability of the heart to fill with blood. So the heart is relaxed and very compliant. It may fill with more blood than the heart is stiff and not very compliant. And this is a property referred to as lusitropy. On the pressure-volume loop, increased preload deflects the right hand of the pressure-volume loop, rightwards, and such that you get a higher left ventricular end diastolic volume. Pressure is then generated, and for the same afterload, meaning the same pressure to open the aortic valve, despite the heart being more full, it gets down to the same end systolic volume. Hence, contraction or contractility increases as a result of an increase in preload. And this is how you illustrate the Frank-Starling relationship on the pressure-volume loop. The second determinant of systolic function we're going to talk about is inotropy or inotropic state. And inotropy is defined as a condition that for the same preload, so the ventricle is at the same volume, any stimulus that increases contractility. So therefore, it's independent of the Frank-Starling relationship. So increases in preload will increase contraction. But for the same preload, if you increase inotropic state, it also increases contractility. And again, contracts to a smaller left ventricular end systolic volume, thereby increasing stroke volume. And there are several physiologic states in which we increase our inotropic state of the heart. That includes the sympathetic nervous system. So when you're activated and very nervous or anxious, your contractility will increase. And when you exercise, naturally, contractility will also increase to increase stroke volume and increase cardiac output. So on the pressure-volume loop, this is illustrated. In black is a control or resting pressure-volume loop. In the red is a pressure-volume loop with increased inotropic state. And you can see that at the lower right-hand corner, preload is about the same, in fact, a little bit smaller in the red loop, but that when you increase pressure and open the aortic valve, ejection is greater at a higher inotropic state, getting you to a smaller left ventricular end systolic volume. The last loading condition we're going to discuss is something known as afterload. And this is a more complex concept, and it can be thought of in more than one way. So quantitatively, it's actually described as something known as wall tension in the ventricular wall during ejection. A lot of people also think of afterload as the pressure or resistance, or afterload, that the heart must overcome to eject blood. Big increases in afterload actually clamp down the heart and decrease stroke volume. So I'm going to start with an analogy or an extreme example to try and get you to think about afterload. So let's say we actually sew or seal the aortic valve shut, like a jar, right, which we lock, so that no matter how hard we squeeze, ejection is impossible. We can't actually eject any blood. This is actually known as an isovolumic, non-ejecting beat. So the pressure will rise to something known as Pmax, or maximum pressure, right, without actually any ejection. And then at end systole, the pressure is very high when contraction is completed and cross-bridge formation starts to uncross, right, or myocyte bridges start to relax. You get rapid relaxation. No stroke volume is ejected in a beat like this. And this is an example of extreme or very high afterload. And how we actually measure that quantitatively is, as I said, wall tension. So we measure wall tension at end systole. Wall tension is calculated by the law of Laplace. As you may remember, the law of Laplace is pressure within the chamber times its radius divided by 2 times the chamber wall thickness, where pressure is the pressure in the ventricle at the end of systole. So for a non-ejecting or isovolumic beat, right, that end systolic pressure is very high, which correlates with a very high afterload. Here's an example of a pressure volume loop reflecting increased afterload in a physiologic circumstance. So in the dashed lines is our control pressure volume loop, and in the black is our pressure volume loop that reflects increased afterload. So again, both loops start at the same left ventricular end diastolic volume, so that point at the lower right-hand side of the curve. But with higher afterload, the ventricle must generate increased pressure to open the aortic valve. So a lot of the energy of the heart is devoted to pressure work without actually a lot of ejection. When the valve opens, ejection occurs, but left ventricular end systolic pressure is high, yet stroke volume is actually decreased. So much of the energy goes into increasing pressure, there's less left over for ejection. Left ventricular end systolic pressure is increased, so end systolic wall tension must be high. Common causes of increased afterload include aortic stenosis, where it takes a lot of pressure to open a stiff aortic valve, or systemic hypertension, where again it takes more pressure by the left ventricle to generate ejection. The normal or healthy left ventricle can actually tolerate fairly large increases in afterload, without much compromise to ejection. However, if left ventricular ejection fraction is decreased, such as in heart failure, which you will get another lecture about, afterload can profoundly impair ejection and thus profoundly depress cardiac output. Patients with heart failure due to reduced ejection fraction are therefore referred to as afterload sensitive. So in summary, the determinants of systolic function include increased preload, which by the Frank-Starling relationship, an intrinsic property of the myocardium, increased stroke volume and cardiac output. Increases in afterload are also determinants of systolic function, and increases in afterload tend to decrease stroke volume and depress cardiac output, particularly in patients who have weak hearts. And finally, increased inotropic state, which is a physiologic way of increasing stroke volume and cardiac output when you exercise, increased contractility, thereby increasing stroke volume and cardiac output. By now, you should be able to describe the loading conditions and their influence on cardiac output. Thanks very much, and I hope you enjoyed this self-learning module.